Well, my name is Amy Gillaspie. Thank you for tuning in for our talk today. Gene is present with his CRM class that I'll talk about in this presentation. But I want to acknowledge that I am presenting here from Denver, as well as our excavations at the Wootton site in downtown Denver are on the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. And today I'm going to be speaking about our dig on the Auraria campus, known as the Wootton site. So I plan to go over the history of this site to introduce you to it, talk about the archaeological work, including student and volunteer involvement, and then present some of the preliminary results. So Auraria itself was founded in, let me pull up my pointer here. Auraria was founded in 1858 at the end of the year. This is an early rendition of Auraria, Denver, and the Highland during that time frame. Auraria being this location here, what would become downtown Denver, this location here, and the Highland right here. This being the South Platte River and Cherry Creek coming up to this confluence location right here. This area was actually populated and under treaty from 1851 on. It was populated by the Arapaho and Cheyenne people that would come every winter to camp at this site, and gold was found at Cherry Creek. And in such, settlers came to the area and started to settle here in 1858. And here's another rendition of the early history of this location for Denver history itself specifically. On Christmas Eve of 1858, a man named Richens Lacey Wootton came to town. He came up from New Mexico with a couple of wagons and his wife, and he had flour, sugar, and other provisions, including alcohol, that he brought with him. He wanted to trade with the indigenous populations that were here. And when he arrived to Auraria, he was actually surrounded by miners because at the point that he came to town, there were no stores set up yet. So the miners in the area were eager to get their hands on the provisions that he had brought in for trade. And the next morning, the legend goes that him and his wife set up barrels of Taos Lightning, which was whiskey, and shared them, quoted as saying, "Hello, neighbor," to everyone that came by to get a glass of whiskey. And they partied all day. Unseasonably warm, nice day throughout. It's reported that some of the founders of Denver, including William Russell and William Larimer, were at this celebration on Christmas Day, and everyone spent time together. And in this, Richens Wheaton ended up becoming a very popular person. So he was awarded some land in Auraria. A few months later, he began to build on this parcel of land that he was awarded. And he built the first two-story structure in Auraria, both out of hewn wood, and had glass in the windows, which was unheard of. This two-story building became a general store. Him seeing that there needed to be somebody providing provisions, he jumped right on that and created a general store. Here, this arrow points to the diorama that's at History Colorado of early Denver. And the arrow points to this two-story structure. To the right there, this is 2 months later in April, Wootton built a structure for himself and his wife to live in. And in addition to that, he built what was the Western Saloon. And this was a really renowned location because there was a bowling alley there was a bowling alley attached to the building. Sorry, my son is in school looking for lunch. A bowling alley was attached to the back of this saloon, and so that became quite the spot to be located in. Let me find my space. So the two locations here are important to early Denver history because this two-story log cabin that was built is home of the first location where the printing press was brought into the second-story attic space and the Rocky Mountain News published its first newspaper out of this space. They moved their offices a few months later from this location, but this is where the Rocky Mountain News began. In addition to that, over here at the Western Saloon, there was a delegation and quite a few meetings that occurred over 1859 where groups would gather together to petition the state of Jefferson, which would, of course, go on to become the state of Colorado. The early delegations failed, but this was an important location because of this early political setup for Denver and desire to create statehood in Denver, which was Kansas territory at the time. The Rocky Mountain News moved out of the attic of the two-story building in 1860, and the Western Saloon by this point had gained quite a reputation of being a low establishment. There are stories about the Rocky leaving because that the people that were printing the Rocky would, line the floor of the attic with extra boards because stray bullets would be shot, and they, slept with the printing press materials, and the Western Saloon just kind of came into disarray. So Wootton believed that Denver itself would decline, that it would not increase in stature or become a city. And he moved away. He sold all of his holdings and moved away in 1861 with his family down south toward Pueblo to try his hand at farming. But the structures that he had were sold off at that time. And he moved on, and most of you, I'm sure, probably know that he had a hand later on in his life in helping build Raton Pass between along the area where I-25 is now, between New Mexico and Colorado. A few years later after that, the first of quite a few floods that have affected Denver came through. In May of 1864, this flood came through, and with Denver being on higher ground than Auraria, Cherry Creek flooded into Auraria and wiped out quite a few buildings. A little bit higher elevation photo shows some of the extent of damage, and you can see leaning buildings and buildings taken off of their foundations in this flood. Now, there's no direct record of Wootton's buildings specifically being damaged or destroyed in that flood, but I'll get to that in just a second. To situate ourselves in modern times, let me first kind of go over, this is the Auraria Campus. And so right here is what's now downtown Denver with Larimer Square here. This is Auraria Parkway with I-25 running through, and Colfax and Spear Boulevard. So this is now AHEC, which is the Center for Metropolitan State University of Denver, the Denver campus of CU, as well as Community College of Denver. And the Wootton site is located right here off of what is Walnut and 11th Streets. To give a satellite image, here is the campus itself, again, bordered by Spear and Auraria Parkway. Just off over here is I-25. And Wootton's location is right there on this little strip of land that somehow has not been developed. This building is a Spring Hill Suites, and MSU runs their hospitality classes and program through this building, but this whole strip of land is at this time undeveloped. I'll go through a little bit of the history of what else between Wootton and the Auraria campus that this land has been through. So again, not knowing if Wootton's buildings that were built on that location were destroyed or not, the first insurance map that we have been able to find, is in 1868. This based insurance map shows no buildings at that street corner. The street names are historic names. They've changed since then, but there's nothing at that location at that time. And for 70 years, various iterations of buildings came in, houses were built, became less of a business area and more of a neighborhood. And this whole location was destroyed this entire block was destroyed in 1939 for the Wazi Marketplace, which was an open air market with stalls that sat on this block. And it was the Wazi Marketplace until AHEC, the Auraria Higher Education Center, purchased it in the early 1970s. And since 1972, this specific location has been the property of AHEC and still is today. So let me talk a little bit about the student and volunteer involvement then on the archaeological aspect of where we came in through this history. There is still a Community College of Denver course that Gene Wheaton teaches right here, my co-author, and the PI on this. He teaches a CRM course, a 200 level CRM course at Community College of Denver, and combined some previous work that was done with GPR and some talks about doing work at the 9th Street Historic Park, and applied for funding to have an archaeological field school for his class at this strip of land here to determine if the Wootton site is still present. So we began teaching the course. I came on as the crew chief. We began teaching the course in the fall semester of 2019 and had an amazing first semester with that class. Students worked in everything from learning about CRM in the classroom setting. Gene also brought in aspects of GIS, but then we had the practical on-campus experience of excavation. And here students are working on mapping different artifacts in situ. They did profile work. We had Troy come in from Frontier Precision. He has been wonderful, and teach total station to the students and give them experience to work with this. We plot pointed different artifacts and items and locations throughout the site. So they had some really great hands-on aspects with that. With that, Gene worked with layering different historic maps and insurance maps together to find both the location of where Wootton's buildings were, as some of the historic accounts differ slightly and some of the locations differ slightly in the mid 1800s accounts. In addition, with insurance maps to see what else was in that space, to see if the Wootton location would have been present due to the fact that it was such a great foundation and building when it was built in the 1850s. So students got to work with that. They had the excavation experience, of course, the screening photo, and working with profiles. We had this amazing stratigraphy at the site that was just the most natural teaching tool. It was wonderful. So I'll go into this a little bit more here in the future. And just, of course, some of the artifacts that you would expect to come out from a historic dig. We have brick, glass, a little bit of hewn wood, some service items, plates, things like that. Of course, spring semester rolls around of 2020, and it was winter, and our site was snowed over, so we were waiting to go back and excavate in March, which, of course, we all know now did not happen. Our campus was closed down due to COVID, and Gene did this great, fast, smooth transition and pivot to online teaching with the spring semester students, provided them information with Wootton and worked through GIS with them on Wootton itself and the site itself and work that we had done previously, but also created the final project for that semester was a pretend situation in which a state park was having some proposed changes, and students represented different groups of importance. So one student represented SHPO, one student represented TIPO, one represented the construction company, and on, different groups came in, and together for their final, they all talked through expanding this state park. So it ended up working out great for that group, and we offered them to come back when we open excavation back up. AHEC actually gave us the permission in summer of 2020. We had a smaller enrollment of students and enough to fit in guidelines to have students on site since we were outdoors. If we practiced social distancing and masking, which we did, so we actually began excavation again in summer of 2020, and that continued into about the middle of fall, at which point laboratory analysis started, and the spring semester that is ongoing and being wrapped up at this time. So some of the preliminary results on site. The different layers, or I'm sorry, the different levels of the stratigraphy correspond directly, mostly with different construction and demolition events.
About 5 minutes.
And thank you so much. I'll go back here again to the photo that shows that stratigraphy, but we have our topsoil as our most present layer. There was a ball field that Auraria installed for baseball, which was just all sand, and it was one of the most pleasant things to excavate ever because it was sand. It was wonderful. Between that, there was a beautification project that happened where some streets were rerouted and Auraria Parkway was moved around the campus, and there was a little bit of landscaping project done there. But we have construction layers below that where we have the demolition and the buildup above that from the Wazi Marketplace, as well as the demolition of the block to create the marketplace. And then below that is just mixed debris showing that demolition event. So again, our stratigraphy with our ground soil, you can actually see some netting and some astroturf here. This is all sand that was laid down for the ball field. So this was the construction layer for the Wazi Marketplace. And this was the construction layer for the block prior to that, where houses were built and whatnot after the flood. Below this is all just mixed debris. You can see the start of some brick, and it was just chock full of a mixture of matrix itself, as well as just plenty of historic event artifacts that had no rhyme or reason, just churned up and leveled out. So analysis has begun on the artifacts themselves. We did do 2 different excavation units. For the fall 2019, we placed a unit toward the back of the Western Saloon where the bowling alleys were. And then in summer, we moved forward to the 2-story cabin location where the Rocky Mountain News published, closer to the street. And the analysis on the artifacts coming out of that trench are what are still being worked on. But here is some information on the artifacts that came out of the Western Saloon unit, all historic items. And you can see as by layer here. When we pivoted in summer to the other location, due to how everything had changed, that we had not necessarily lost, but had time constraints due to the fact that we no longer had the spring semester that we were able to excavate, we decided to bring in a backhoe to do a trench instead and speed up the process, which was a different learning experience for students, of course. But here we found at the 2-story cabin construction the same stratigraphy as well as the same artifact types. There was slightly difference. There in this trench here, there was a location or the inclusion of a specific sort of tile that almost looks like what's popular in kitchen backsplash right now, long white tiles. So we're not sure if that was flooring or what it was, but it was just mixed in that construction debris with everything else. So to touch briefly on some of the research questions, there's more than this for the project that are being finished at this time. But these 3 I thought were important to kind of address. So the first being, does the Wootton site retain the necessary integrity needed to be eligible as a nationally significant historical site? When we got to the bottom with the backhoe, when we got to the bottom of the trench, there was a concrete slab that we thought could have possibly been like a foundation or a flooring to something historic, not Wootton specifically, as it was concrete. And the backhoe person excavated further beyond that, and we found out that it was actually a retaining wall that had been toppled over. So if there is anything specifically linked to the foundation of Wootton's original site, it is under 7 inches of concrete at this time. Other than that, the demolition, thank you. The construction and the demolition that took place historically from 1870 on has done quite a good job of eradicating any other evidence of anything prior to that, except for those construction events. Are there intact remains located in areas of the site slated for development? So future development for AHEC itself, if they'd like to, I think there's talk of making it a parking lot. At this time, again, there are not. If it is, it's under that concrete. And an important question, are there indications of a Native American presence? The artifacts that we recovered were all historic. We did not recover anything that we would indicate as indicative of a Native American presence. So at this point, I would like to say thank you to everybody that was involved with the project, the people that helped with the project overall. This is Ryan and Jasmine. Jasmine's our student archaeologist, and Ryan has been the most extraordinary volunteer that we've had on site. In addition, we have Andrew Long as our intern. You can't tell it's him because he's covered in a hat and a mask, but many thanks to him, as well as Troy at Frontier Precision, and all of our students and volunteers that came out to the site. Many thanks. It was a wonderful excavation, and I feel like quite a few people were able to get an experience with archaeology they wouldn't otherwise in the middle of a city on their own campus, which was great. I'd also like to thank the 2018 Archaeological Methods class for the historic research, David Hill's Museum Studies class at MSU from 2013 that did